Well, welcome everybody. I'm Gary Seymour, the director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies. Thank you all for attending at this difficult but consequential time for peace and security in the Middle East. I particularly want to thank President Leibowitz for coming and Dean Scholson, who've been leading the university through these hard and difficult times. To begin our program, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Marilyn Diamond, who is the chair of the Crown Center Board of Advisors, to make some introductory remarks. In addition to chairing the Crown Center Board of Advisors, Marilyn is the honorary counsel for Morocco in Illinois, so she's very familiar with the region. And she serves on a number of other important boards, including the Chicago Council for Global Affairs and the Harris School of Public Policy Studies at the University of Chicago. We've benefited tremendously from her knowledge and her strong leadership and her enthusiastic support for better understanding and better relations between the United States and the countries of the region. So please join me in welcoming Marilyn, who has flown in from Chicago to join us.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak about the Crown Center. The Crown Center was established in 2005 by founding director Shai Feldman and senior fellows Abdel Monem Said Aly and Khalil Shikaki, all of whom we are privileged to have with us today. They were aware that most work being done on the Middle East was biased and coming from a pro-Arab perspective. They understood that in order to better analyze the region's multifaceted challenges and opportunities, there needed to be rigorous and dispassionate scholarship that would be approached from an interdisciplinary perspective. They were strongly supported in their beliefs by then Brandeis President Yehuda Reinhardt and philanthropist Lester Crown. 18 years later, we are proud to say that our researchers come from every country in the Middle East, and in the aggregate, they represent every discipline in the social sciences. Today, the Crown Center enjoys the wide respect of academics, policymakers, and the general public through its conferences, publications, podcasts, and other outreach efforts. Together with Brandeis, we strengthen our mutual commitment to the core values of intellectual curiosity, diversity, and the pursuit of truth. So happy birthday, Brandeis, and may you go from strength to strength.
Well, as Marilyn said, the Crown Center was founded in 2005, 18 years ago. And from the beginning, the Arab-Israeli conflict was one of the central research topics for the founding director, Shai Feldman, and the founding senior fellows, Abdel Monem Said Aly and Khalil Shikaki. And the result of their collaboration was a remarkable team-taught course, and later a textbook called the Arabs and Israelis, Conflict and Peacemaking in the Middle East. And this is really required reading for anyone who wants to understand the Arab-Israeli conflict in its historical complexity. The authors explain the conflict on the basis of diverse narratives, Israeli, Palestinian, and Arab, on the basis of balanced and dispassionate analysis. In recent years, the salience of the Arab-Israeli conflict has faded, which reflected domestic political developments in the region, regional developments like the Abraham Accord, and to some extent, international peace process fatigue. But as the Hamas terrorist attacks on October 7th and the impending Israeli invasion of Gaza remind us, sometimes neglect and inattention can blow up in your face. Now we're facing a situation where we have to consider the horrific consequences of what's happening and whether or not there are any way forward after the fighting is done. So the spirit of balanced and dispassionate research that embodies the Crown Center credo is more important than ever in order to understand what has happened and to analyze the potential implications for future peacemaking efforts going forward. So I'm going to turn now to our moderator, Professor Mikhail Ben-Yosef, who's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and Legal Studies at Suffolk University, and we're proud to say a former senior fellow at the Crown Center. So I'll turn things over to Mikhail, who will introduce the panelists and conduct the meeting. Mikhail.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary, for the introduction. This event was originally planned under a different title and different circumstances as part of the 75th anniversary celebration of Brandeis University. This year, we also note 75 years to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Note coincidentally, these two events are closely related, as both Brandeis University and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights emerge in response to the atrocities of World War II and the Holocaust, and out of the commitment to and aspiration for the principles of universal justice and universal humanity that is endowed with inherent and inalienable human rights. I would like to take a pause for a moment to acknowledge the humans, both Palestinians and Israelis, victims of human rights violations and abuses, whose life has been and will forever be affected by the latest horrific attacks and the ensuing escalating violence. Our event today will be divided into two parts. First, for about 45 minutes, our distinguished panelists will address three general basic questions. What explained this horrific and unexpected eruption of violence? What are the shorter and the longer-term ramifications of these events? And under what condition would a bilateral Israeli-Palestinian or regional Arab-Israeli political settlement will ever be possible? These are big questions. At the second part, which will be about 40 minutes, we will have Q&A from our audience here in the room. Unfortunately, we cannot accept questions from the audience on the Zoom call. We left this plenty of time for Q&A because we truly believe that the essence is about discussion. As a teacher, let me now introduce our panelists. An Israeli, an Egyptian, and a Palestinian could be the beginning of a good joke. But in our case, the panelists are unique scholars and teachers that together really envisioned a balanced, informed, and dispassionate approach to explain and teach the Arab-Israeli and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As a teacher of the conflict, I'm grateful for our panelists for the book, Arabs and Israelis, Conflict and Peacemaking in the Middle East. Specifically, the books introduce the students to the different narratives, competing narratives, about almost every important development in the history of the conflict. Our panelists emphasize correctly that understanding the gap between the narratives is the key to explaining the escalation of the conflict and any prospect for peacemaking. Shai Feldman is the Raymond Frankel Chair in Israel Politics and Society at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies and a professor of politics at Brandeis University. As already noted, from 2005 to 2019, Shai was the founder and Crown Family Director of the Crown Center. From 1997 to 2005, he served as the head of Tel Aviv University Yaffa Center for Strategic Studies. And in 2019 to 22, he took a post from Crown and served as the president of Sapir Academic College in Sha'ar Negev, Israel, which was affected recently in the attack. Abdel Monem Said Aly is the chairman of the board and CEO of Al-Masri Al-Yum Publishing House in Cairo, and the former chairman of the board, CEO, and director of Regional Center for Strategic Studies in Cairo. He is the founding senior fellow in the Crown Center for Middle East Studies and has also served as president of Al-Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies in Cairo. He was the chairman of the board of the CEO of Al-Ahram newspaper and publishing house, and was a member of the board of Al-Ahram institutions and the director of Al-Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies. He was also a research fellow both at the Brookings Institute at the Belfer Center at the Kennedy School. And in 2014, he founded the Gulf Arab State Institute in Washington. Khalil Shikaki is the director, has directed the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah since 2000, and has conducted more than 100 polls among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip since 1993. He's also a founding senior fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis, and formerly a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He is a world-renowned expert on Palestinian public opinion and a widely published author. He has taught in several institutions, including in Birzeit University, Al-Najah National University, the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and the University of South Florida. I will move directly to our first question. What explained this horrific, unexpected eruption and violence? And I will direct first, my first question is, how do we even explain this kind of events as political scientists? And before I go to Shai, I'm borrowing a sentence that I heard last week in a different forum, which is really important for us to remember that we are here explaining the event, not justifying any aspect of the event.
So what we're going to do is follow the logic of the textbook. The textbook is a 13-chapter book for a 13-week American semester. And all the 13 chapters have the same structure. The first third of every chapter, we call it main developments. It gives readers a sense of what happened. And it basically summarizes those aspects along the history of the conflict that are not in dispute between Israelis, Palestinians, other Arabs, and so on and so forth. One British scholar, when the first edition came out 10 years ago, said he found the most surprising aspect of the book that we could fill a whole third of every chapter with things that were not in dispute. He rather thought it was impossible to do that. The second section of every chapter provides the readers the competing narratives, the Israeli narrative, the Palestinian narrative, and Arab narratives about the important turning points in the history of the conflict. And the third section of every chapter is, we call it analysis, which is the analytical framework that we use to try to explain what happened. And so we basically applied this analytical framework to about 22 major turning points in the history of the conflict. And that analytical framework is actually very, very, very simple. It basically says, if you want to understand anything about the history of the conflict, you have to answer 4 questions. One, what happened in the international, the global system, that can explain what happened, what just happened in the conflict? Second, what happened in the region? What happened in the Middle East that can explain that particular turning point in Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli history? The third question is, what happened in the domestic politics of the main protagonists that can explain what just happened? And the fourth one, which is kind of related to the third one, but still, whenever possible, we address it as distinct, which is, what was the role of individuals, especially individual leaders? In parenthesis, I will tell you that what we see in going through these 22 major turning points is that the relative weight of these four factors change from crisis to crisis, which makes it even more interesting and applicable. This is the framework, and since we began with the global and the regional, and then moved to the domestic, and then say some things about the individual, in trying to respond to Michal's questions, we're going to follow that order. And since Abdel Monem presents the region, he'll go first.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michal. I want to start with a point that I learned from the book, which is as follows, that in every event of the Arab-Israeli conflict, there is either we have an existential situation or it is a non-existential situation. The existential situation is the one that really forbids the idea of reconciliation. The non-existential one, it gives a lot of possibilities to move on with much more conciliation. Here it comes. What's about this event is the following. We have something like steam, the steam cook pot, in which you have really the steam and the temperature is going high, whether by Israeli right or Hamas or whoever, but there is a moment in which this steam pot can explode. So now what is, the environment we are here in the crisis globally and regionally. Globally, we have what I will say it as a global moment of vacuum. The big gods of the world are very busy. I can't think of the Madrid conference without the agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union. That was non-existential point. Now an existential point, we have both sides are in different completely camps. And there is another war going on. It is at this moment not in the limelight. However, it is there and it affected the calculations of the United States, Russia, China, the big powers of the global order. But on the regional order, there are other things that's happening in the same time. We learned from Graham Allison something about called the Thucydides dilemma, which when Athens were getting strong, Sparta decided to make war. We have a situation that is situational, not related to one specific power. But there was a country that was very close in the region for making peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia. This is, the last thing, we heard it. It was an interview done by the Fox channel and Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And he said, we are getting closer.
Every day.
Imagine here that development, not only about Israel and Saudi Arabia, which is something was good and it could have a lot of non-existential results. However, it was about that the agreement is not coming about Israel and Saudi Arabia. It's coming about the regional order by which the United States will guarantee the security of Saudi Arabia for some time to come. Plus, allow Saudi Arabia to start a nuclear capability role, which will mean, in my opinion, Egypt will follow. Egypt is following, and everybody will follow because Israel got a nuclear bomb before. So that kind of accumulation of regional changes goes far beyond, and it makes somebody like Iran is really, I see Iran, despite, a lot of, saying in the United States that it has nothing to do with what's happening, that as the main reason of what's happening. Hamas could not and will not do anything without Iran is involved. Iran saw that the geopolitical order of the Middle East is about to change. And it will change fundamentally. So that is the one, the first, regional change that I see it leading to where we are now in this crisis. Thank you.
Khalil, would you tell us about the Palestinian society?
Yes. I do agree with Abdel Monem in a lot of what he said regarding the systemic and the regional environment that has provided the context for the Hamas offensive. But I think it is only related to the timing of the offensive and nothing else. What was the most important driving forces were domestic. And the domestic conditions, both in the West Bank and Gaza, this is not restricted to conditions in the Gaza Strip where Hamas rules. And in both places, the level of discontent that survey research show is simply unprecedented. There is no militancy we see in both societies, both in West Bank and Gaza, regarding the ruling elite. There is no militancy against the ruling elite. There is no demand for violence against the ruling elite, against Abbas in the West Bank or against Hamas leadership in Gaza. But there is absolutely no doubt that there is significant discontent. Now, what protects Abbas and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, but does not protect Hamas in Gaza, is the fact that conditions, economic conditions, are much better. They're not great, but they're much better than they are in the Gaza Strip. Unemployment in the Gaza Strip, for example, is 45%, while it is just 15% in the West Bank. So that is, and if you look at the per capita income in Gaza, it is $1,000. West Bank, $4,000. So you can see that in the West Bank, the discontent, while great, is still, with economic conditions somewhat working, there is no desire to destabilize the Palestinian Authority in a manner that could bring about significant violence against the Palestinian Authority. In Gaza, however, something that did not happen in the West Bank, at least in the last 2 years, but in Gaza, just 4 months ago, demonstrations by young people in Gaza took place. And when we asked Palestinians about these, both in Gaza and the West Bank, and I asked, why are people demonstrating? It was very clear to everyone that the reason is people are unhappy with living conditions in the Gaza Strip. And they blame Hamas for that. Hamas is more popular in Gaza than it is in the West Bank. But more than 60%, in fact 62% of Gazans reject Hamas. The percentage is much higher in the West Bank. So despite the fact that Hamas is more popular in Gaza, there were these demonstrations that Hamas, I believe, was worried about. Why is Hamas worried? Because Hamas essentially, since 2007, has failed in governing the Gaza Strip. Hamas has tried 3 ways out of the misery of Gaza. One, which it tried immediately after it took over Gaza and all the way until 2013. So this is about 6 years of attempt to try what I would call Egypt's exit. That is, to make Gaza a mini state for Hamas, opening the borders with Egypt, create a political economy in which Hamas can actually rule and improve conditions, economic conditions included, economic conditions in the Gaza Strip. This was about to happen, and in fact almost happened in 2013. In 2012 and 2013, when Morsi was president. This seems to be finally working. And under the previous Egyptian administration, when Mubarak was there, Mubarak allowed the tunnels to operate. There were hundreds of tunnels, 1,300 tunnels underneath the borders in Egypt that provided meaningful economic conditions for Hamas to be able to. Sisi came and destroyed that. So and since then, since 2013, this option was no longer at the table. The second option, starting in 14, continuing all the way until 21, was the PA option. The PA, the Palestinian Authority's option, which is to reintegrate Hamas into the Palestinian political process, essentially forego the idea of a semi-state or a mini-state in the Gaza Strip. Abbas said no. There were times in which it looked as if there was progress being made, But one issue, one fundamental issue, which was the unspoken condition for reintegration of Hamas, which is to disarm Hamas. Abbas could never publicly state that this is a precondition, but it was. And his security services refused to allow the reunification without disarming Hamas. Eventually, Abbas, under pressure also from Sisi to try and do something, did go along for a short period with that. But it failed miserably in 21. 21 was the year in which Abbas promised there would be elections that would then lead, whoever wins the elections would then reunify the West Bank and Gaza. Abbas canceled those elections. With that, Hamas ended this second exit out of the limbo in which Gaza remains in today. There was a third way out, a third exit, which was Israel. Israel would provide an exit for Hamas. How? Israel would give Hamas, or Hamas would give Israel, a long-term hudna or truce, where Israel would allow Gaza access to the sea, some free movement, reducing or removing the siege and blockade over Gaza. The idea of a mini-state was all of a sudden alive, not through Egypt, but through Israel. What was Israel's goal? Why would Israel go along with that? Well, because it means Hamas and Gaza, Abbas and the West Bank, Palestinians are divided, and Hamas, if Hamas is still there, this would be the ugly face of the Palestinians. Israel can use at any given moment. Even the most extreme Israeli right-wing minister today in the Israeli government, Smotrich, in 2015 said, Hamas is a great asset for Israel. As long as it controls Gaza, this is the face we will present the international community with, so it serves our interests. I know you want me to do this. I will end in just 1 minute. Sure. The new Israeli government, the Bennett-Lapid government was willing to give Hamas what it wanted. Negotiations failed over the issue of the prisoners' release. The new Israeli government that started early this year would not even discuss that. That was a total failure. I think at that moment, Hamas leadership was divided. Sinwar and the more extreme, I would consider Sinwar of Hamas leaders to be the most pragmatic and the most moderate. Hamas, Sinwar wanted this to be his Sadat moment in the sense of having a limited offensive that end with a limited accommodation with Israel. Other Hamas leaders wanted this to be the Samson option. Use whatever capacity Hamas has to inflict as much suffering, pain and suffering in Israel as possible. In both cases, reminding the world that there is a Palestinian cause at the end of the day. That was not Sinwar's intentions, I believe. Sinwar hoped that he would be the new Sadat and that he would reach an agreement. That, I think, was Hamas's calculus. The Saudi deal only provided the timing. The Ukraine war created polarization that Hamas, Iran, and others wanted to exploit, and so on. The demonstrations in Israel provided opportunity here. Israel is weak. Let's take advantage of that. The fact that the West Bank was boiling because of the formation of armed groups meant the Israeli army was moving forces to the West Bank. Again, the opportunity was there that Sinwar wanted to take advantage of it.
Sorry.
We can move to the third one because
He covered it.
Khalil just covered Israel.
Yeah, but let's organize. Yeah.
I'm leaving it up to you.
So first of all, I think that, the first thing you could already, first takeaway from this discussion already is you can see that on the issue that, the question that I raised, which is the relative weight of these factors, whether it's global, regional, domestic, and I said they change from time to time, from crisis to crisis, you could also see that we don't always agree on the relative weight, including the relative weight of the factors that can explain what just happened 10 days ago. The other thing that I think came out very clearly already from Abdel Monem and Khalil is the distinction between what we sometimes call basic factors that are constant in a way or semi-constant, and situational context and situational factors. The situational factors answer the question, or are attempting to answer the question of why now. In this particular case, it's the question is, why in 2023? So I think it's clear that there are some basic factors here. Gaza as an entity was isolated. It was isolated by Israel and Egypt. And that has implications because people, generally speaking, are not too happy with being completely separate from the rest of the world. The other factor, and I'll say this on the Israeli side, is that I am not sure, in parenthesis, that you can say that Hamas itself had a strategy. Khalil mentioned how they basically dealt with and considered three different options. In all my conversations and some conversations that we had with Khalil about 15 years ago with some of the actors on the Hamas scene, it wasn't really clear that Hamas had a strategy. Why am I saying this? Because what is clear to me is that Israel did not have a strategy, not a comprehensive strategy for how to deal with this issue called Gaza. And the complexity here is that it was not unclear. I'm using a British understatement. It was not unclear what Hamas was trying to achieve. In many ways, it's the solution to the fact that they were an isolated entity. It wasn't clear what was the strategy that unified this effort, and especially what was the responses to the Israeli concerns of trying to meet their requirements in a situation in which Hamas did not change its fundamental ideological commitment to destroy Israel. Hamas, this is the big difference between we had a peace process at the state-to-state level, which began in Egypt and then Jordan and then the Abraham Accords and the normalization that was discussed as being around the corner. And we had an Israeli-Palestinian peace process with the PLO. But that was, again, it was a gradual change in positions on the part of the PLO and Israel that allowed us to get to Oslo. Oslo didn't come out of nowhere. It came from an interim program in 1974 and the Declaration of Independence in 1988 of two states side by side, and then Oslo. Hamas was unwilling to travel this road. It was willing to get with Israel into all kinds of pragmatic, practical issues, but it was never willing to think again about its ideological commitment. Now, why was that a problem? It was a problem because the whole issue of the siege had to do with entry and exit. And when in those cases where Hamas operationalized its demand, it was end the siege. Now, just think about it. We're talking about an Islamist entity that did not change one iota its commitment to destroy Israel. And now think about what we discovered in the last 10 days. Of course, intelligence agencies knew this way before. What we discovered in 10 days, what they managed to smuggle into the Gaza Strip with all the siege. How many rockets, how many other ordinances, and so. Now imagine, again, they operationalized the end of siege, first and foremost, to have a port. Now, can you imagine? So this is the Israeli dilemma. The Israeli dilemma is how to respond in a situation where the other side is committed to Israel's destruction, and we knew what the repercussions would be if Israel allowed the siege to end. Now, that's the fundamental. I'll just say a few words about why 2023. It's clear that the domestic, and this is, again, the relative weight of these factors, the domestic Israeli scene, I believe, had a decisive influence over the Hamas decision, which was a decision about 2023. Because Israel created a window of vulnerability. It was a window. Hamas had to act before the window was shut. They recognized the window. Now, what was the window? What did the window consist of? It basically consisted of essentially an internal turmoil which resulted from the most recent Israeli government that tried to, first of all, limit Israeli democracy by changing the balance of power between the various arms of the governing system, but in favor of the executive and the Knesset, and against the judiciary. So that's number one. Number two, they wanted to legislate, I would say, to legislate the exemptions that the ultra-Orthodox had already had from military service. They had it by the fact that the center of the map tolerated the situation. Now they demanded that these rights be legislated. And the third is that the coalition agreement reflected the fact that two parties that were beyond the pale were permitted to enter the government and their leaders to enter the cabinet. Why can I say beyond the pale? What's the objective measure of beyond the pale? It's that previous right-wing governments never included them in the governing coalition. Now, that they had an agenda. The agenda, first of all, was priorities is the West Bank, priorities is provocations in Jerusalem and Temple Mount, which is toxic. So now all of this resulted in very broad protests in Israel. And the core of the protesters were the Israeli reservists. So in that sense, Hamas could have seen all of this. And by the way, this was debated in Israel about what are the risks and costs involved in the protests. And the Minister of Defense and the Chief of Staff and other senior members of the General Staff of the IDF warned the government, warned the Prime Minister, that if they continue with this legislative program, the protests will only escalate. And they said, and we are not isolated. Israel has spectators around it. It has an audience, and the audience is watching, listening, and so on and so forth. And they said they can draw the wrong conclusions. Somewhat, by the way, similar to explaining why Saddam invaded Iran in 1980. Why? Because he thought the revolution in Iran essentially destroyed the Iranian military's fighting capacity. And there is a window of opportunity here. Hamas, I am convinced, believed, because of everything happening in the Israeli domestic scene, that there is an opportunity here. The third and final thing, that goes from the domestic politics, yes, to the individual. Israel was led by a prime minister that was battling personal legal challenges. And it would have been unnatural, unhuman, to believe that you can do that without being distracted. And all I can say for a minute, I'll put on my other hat as an American citizen, not just an Israeli citizen. If the United States of America is contemplating electing in 2024 a person who has to battle personal legal challenges at the same time that he tries to run the only remaining superpower in the world, Israel is complex enough. We've had experience now with what happens when somebody has to deal with corruption-related trials and is trying to run the country. It is doubtless for me that it's only human that somebody like that would be distracted from the need to run the country. And this is, I think, where the domestic scene played a role, especially played a role in explaining why 2023.
So there's a lot. So there's a lot here, and I think there is the distinction between the situational and the more structural conditions is important, because if I may say, in the more structural one, it seems like all three of you highlighted really deep insecurities, whether it be Iranian insecurity from changing balance of powers in the Middle East, Israeli insecurities of having Islamist neighbors, and the Palestinian, the Hamas insecurities of basically losing power domestically. In light of those insecurities, what are some of the more short-term and long-term ramifications or consequences that we can see for the events we are living now? You can do any order. Khalil, why don't you start?
I would say the most important short term, actually there are two most important short term. One is whether the war will expand to include Hezbollah and others, and this becoming a regional war. And the second is, assuming it does not, assuming it remains restricted to bilateral Israeli-Hamas war, in that case, the immediate consequence is the ending of Hamas's rule and the beginning, in my view, of another Hamas rule. I don't think that anybody in the short term has any answer to what happens after Hamas, assuming, again, there's no war with Iran and Hezbollah. Then the question is going to be who will control Gaza in the short term. Egypt is not going to step in. There's zero chance that Egypt will be willing to do that. Abbas is not going to be able to do that, even if he's interested, and he's not interested. He will not be able to do that. No one in Gaza is going to be willing to do that. Israel is not going to be willing and able to do that in the long term. It might be able to stay there for 6 months, but it's not going to want to govern Gaza or control it in a much longer term. Who wants to control Gaza, and who would be willing to come back to control Gaza? Only Hamas. So in the short term, again, assuming there is no wider regional conflict, the question is going to be who will be in control of Gaza, say 6 months down the road? And my answer is Hamas.
So we're in some ways, we've jumped to the third question.
Yes, sir, moving.
I object. We have to continue talking about the second question first.
Yalla.
And then we move to the third question. I mean, that's which I wish I started, because that is a global thing that Khalil tried to take it from me. Let me define the issue as the following. What do we mean by short term and long term? The short term is, as this moment is as an existential point, the more we are digging into it, that's the short term. The long term is possibility, there are possibilities to get out of that or not. Or we will continue getting into deep into the steam cooking pot, just going more boiling and ready to explode even more. The explosion, Khalil referred to it, but I will say it is possible. I mean, we have to learn now from the events that's happening today and before in Ukraine that things sometimes move in their own. We get into a hospital destroyed, a number of massacres, and everybody is talking about what? What is the terminology here? Obliterate, flatten, teach them the historical lesson. What is hovering over all the heads are two things, the Holocaust and the Nakba, together in that kind of fighting. So we have here things that's beyond our calculations. And therefore, I will say that it is highly possible that the whole thing, unless something happens, and that's on the third question, I think we are going into a pathway in which there is an expansion of the area of conflict. It might not happen the way experts will decide it will be, but I think the same militancy has in, Iran was not playing in the past couple of decades in making the mobilization force in Iraq and the Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen and trying everywhere. These guys are ready to get in, and under sometimes their membership, the environment they are living in is pushing them to do something to save the Palestinians. I mean, because they are making from the Palestinian issue a kind of bread and life for them. That is something that they are living for. In one day, either moderately we'll have a Palestinian state, or we have a continuous way of fighting. Expansion is possible. Even I will go and say that it's possible that also Iran will come into it. How it will be, that's kind of the mechanics of the timing that we have. And I will say, and that's in a little bit of a longer term, the success that happened by destroying ISIS will be gone. We will start another ISIS, another Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brothers, Hamas, all terrorism and all kinds of fanaticism will increase. And also now the Israelis are learning to create their own Muslim brothers in a Taurati kind of a move. And looking at the Jewish holy books and getting their literal interpretations into how to dominate other people. I mean, it's not easy for a generation, 50 years that I lived in this conflict, that I learned that always that Israel has one party called the Labour Party. I mean, when they talk about democracy in Israel, said, yeah, they have only one party. And then we have two, the Likud and the Labour Party. And now the Labour Party is gone, and all the middle and center people are gone, and we are getting different variations of the right. And finally, we have the religious right, which is when God into business, really we are in real bad situation. So I will say now, terrorism will be back, and back soon. And that terrorism, as we know it now, it's global. It is not something related only. And as we suffered from it in Egypt in the past 10 years, I think it will be something very lethal. I will say that even I want to exclude, if I took very pessimistic view of the current situation, is really we can go into a big global stuff. I mean, Russia is staying away from what's happening. It's just talking, but if there is a linkage will happen between Ukraine and the Middle East, I think we will have even much more difficult times to come.
Shai, I know we
So-
want to
That's
keep up.
So Abdel Monem almost fixed Israeli domestic politics as well. So
No, maybe you can build on that and actually move to the third question, also in benefit of time.
Yeah.
So with Abdel Monem green picture, realistic maybe in many aspects, under what conditions will there be a more positive development?
okay, so I'll get to that, but what I do want is to say just a few words about the immediate. And again, since my assignment was talk about the Israeli domestic scene and its impact, then I'd like to focus a little bit artificially on where the Israeli domestic scene is. And maybe even at that point, or on this subject, take a little bit of an issue with at least one of the points that my colleague Abdel Monem made. I think on the domestic scene, Israel right now has, in the immediate, a big challenge. First of all, because essentially its most basic sovereignty was breached. The situation now in Israel South is that the population has been relocated. Those who survived the massacres has been relocated to various locations away from the border, which means that if you define sovereignty by having boundaries and control over exit and entry, well, Israel lost control over the entry 10 days ago, and it's essentially lost control for at least for a while. And that control, which is to say the essence of sovereignty, now has to be restored. And that in itself is not going to be easy because the population who survived have been terrorized in every sense. And to persuade them to go back to their former place of residence is going to be very difficult. You're going to have to not only establish security in the objective sense, but also in the subjective sense so that they will feel confident enough. And that's a very tall order given what's happened, given the magnitude of the massacre of 10 days ago. The second thing is that, I would say this, the paradox here, first of all, let me take one very important issue with Abdel Monem's description of the Israeli scene. There is a silver lining in precisely the same developments that led Hamas to believe that there is a window of opportunity. And that is the other side of the protests that engulfed Israel in 10 months. The most important silver lining here is that the center of the Israeli map has woken up. The center basically was damaged significantly by the Second Palestinian Intifada and has essentially been dormant now for 20, 25 years. And what you saw in those 50 Saturdays or 40 Saturdays is a 250,000 Israelis going out and demonstrating Saturday after Saturday after Saturday. I'll just use the same number I used elsewhere in the last few days. It's equivalent to 8.4 million Americans. 8.4 million Americans. So and now every public opinion poll shows that if elections were held today, the governing coalition of today would lose about 10 seats in a Knesset of 120, in which the governing coalition had essentially 4 seats, 64 to 56. From 64, it's down to about 54 but this is, of course, it's hypothetical. It's about what would happen if elections were held today. But it's another indication of the fact that the center is back. So that's number one. Number two, and this now that Abdel Monem invaded the domestic Israeli scene, I'll invade the regional. And I would say this, that catastrophes like Israel experienced 10 days ago happen when you are completely and totally surprised. And Israel suffered a double surprise. It was an intelligence surprise and also an operational surprise. It took the Israeli military 3 or 4 days to just reorient itself to a completely different reality than they were prepared for. The reason I mention this is because the very negative scenario that Abdel Monem ended with is not going to be a surprise. This is actually the multi-front war is actually the dominant scenario that is now occupying the attention and the very few sleeping hours of the IDF Chief of Staff and the Minister of Defense and so on and so forth. This is very important because if Israel, number one, if this is the scenario that Israel is seeing, then it will take some steps to avoid this scenario. Now, some of the most important steps, and it's not just Israel, because the others are also the responsible adults, which is the president of Egypt and the king of Jordan and the MBS in Saudi Arabia and are very aware of this scenario. So what's the what is the alternative here? In my view, that may create a situation of a very, very strong vested and mutual interest by the adults to basically say, this is too important to leave it to the protagonists. We have no choice but to get involved ourselves. Now, they started in that direction under conditions and circumstances that were to a very small extent similar, which was the last major escalation of the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada was the background to the Arab Peace Initiative. The Second Intifada was what led the Saudis, and supported by the other countries, and in the end confirmed by the Arab League in 2002, for the first time, to create an Arab consensus that offered Israel an alternative. The same Arab League that decided in 1948 to invade Palestine and prevent the Jewish state from even existing, now offered Israel. Now, how the Israeli government reacted, that's a different story and a sad story. But the rationale is now the same rationale of 2002, 2003, amplified by a factor of 100. So it's very hard to, because again, the scenario of anarchy is a threat to everybody. It's a threat to Egypt, it's a threat for Jordan. Of course, it's also a threat to Israel. So I actually see that there is some silver lining here. And I think that we've suffered a setback yesterday, because I think that's what President Biden was leading to. That's what the Secretary of State was holding all kinds of preparatory conversations about, trying to help sow this coalition, try to do what in a different universe Henry Kissinger did and Jim Baker did with bringing the not so cooperative parties to Madrid. This is what is required now. And I think that the primary purpose of Biden's visit is, yes, to show support, but also to create the conditions that would allow such a, let's say, corridor out of this mess to at least be considered seriously. So I think that as parties are insecure, they have a very, very strong motivation to do something about it. And, we have an Egyptian and a Palestinian and Israeli, we're all students as political science. And we're all students of a very important scholar from Columbia University, died just a short time ago, by the name of Bob Jervis, who talked about the security dilemma. And the security dilemma, basically, President Sadat, when he came to Israel, he didn't study Jervis, but it was as if he studied Jervis, because he came to the Israeli Knesset and said, look, we understand you have legitimate security concerns. Now you try to respond to address these security concerns by occupying our land or my land called the Sinai Peninsula. That's not acceptable. Let's enter into a conversation about how we cooperate, how we come up with terms that would allow you to meet your legitimate security requirements, not at our expense. And I think that this is basically the basic common denominator between Israel and Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And I think, yes, I thought that when they announced that Biden is coming here, that would be the focus. I think we suffered a major setback. But the fundamental interests of the countries involved has not changed. I think they will come back to this path, whether it will take a week or 2 weeks, because that's the only way out that I see.
So I do want to leave some time for questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask Abdel Monem and Khalil to talk a little bit about the prospects, but in short comments, and then we'll open it for questions. Abdel Monem, why don't you go? Do you want to go first about the prospects?
Yeah, I really agree about the last part that Shai was talking about, and we talk about it a lot between both of us. What we are talking about is what are the mechanics of moving from one situation that's existential to make it non-existential, which means that everybody find an interest in a new situation that actually we were in. I mean, if we came back 10 days ago, after, the talk of Mohammed bin Salman, we'll find everybody in a bit optimist. Israel got, the day of being recognized of the Islamic world and an important country. Not only an important country, but also influential in terms of oil, money, can finance and fund and stuff like this. Much more, I will say that there is something has to be done in terms of statecraft and political issue, which reducing extremism is very important. And I am saying that since the last 10 years, in a number of other Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, a number of Gulf states, the idea of the renewal of religious thought is an important part of a scheme of modernization and reform. Reform that emphasizes nation state, which means national interests, not making the God's interests or goals in a specific situation. So we have the nation statehood is important. And that's where we can allocate the Palestinian issue, that the idea of nation statehood, Saudi Arabia doesn't know what does it mean a nation state, just Islam, a sword and la ilaha illallah. Then we have penetration of the region of every country, Egypt. These are not just deserts. It is a region. Region is the basics of states. I will say there is also mobilization of resources. Most countries are not now working about the management of poverty. It is the management of wealth. And then make sure that the youth, particularly, which is about 60% of the population in Arab countries, they are really got a role in what's happening in their own countries. So we have here a mechanism that's called for how to de-escalate, how to decide something that I will say on the Arab side, Hamas got to be out. It is an operational thing. It is not something that there is no way that Hamas continues because it's against all the other reformist ideas that's taking over in the region. How that will happen, I will say, not by telling the Hamas to go out, but we'll go to the original, which is there is one only representative of the Palestinian people, which is the PLO and the BA. These are the guys that actually taking care of the crossing points. When Hamas wanted somebody to make the crossing points, they bring the Palestinian Authority. Then the Palestinian Authority, is it weak? And so forth. The weak can be strengthened. And therefore, my call in Egypt and my call in the Arab world is those countries who got peace with Israel got to sit together, make something reasonable on how to do the following, which is minimize to the bottom extremism and also highlight the nation building issue.
Assuming that there is no regional war. If there is a regional war, then the regional balance of power will be completely altered. And I don't want to get into what would be then the long-term implications of that. Let's just put this aside, although there is, as Abdel Monem said, there is a serious prospect that this could happen, assuming it doesn't. So the long term, what could happen? I think what we're looking at perhaps might be the narrowing of the gap between the two dimensions of the conflict, the Arab-Israeli and the Palestinian-Israeli. There is absolutely no doubt that one of the greatest successes of Hamas's offensive is that it tells everyone in the region, Israel in particular, but also the international community and the US, that you cannot move forward on the Arab-Israeli dimension as if there is no Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It is not going to happen. The Palestinian, if you want peace in the region, the Palestinians have to be, Israeli-Palestinian issue has to be addressed. I think you really have to be very, very stupid if you do not get it. If you do not get it, the bloodshed that we have seen in the last few days is just a reminder of the horrible things that could happen if we leave this conflict as it is and just focus on the Arab-Israeli dimension. So the narrowing of the Arab-Israeli dimension, the gap between the two dimensions, it could mean that in order to ensure what Abdel Monem wants is for Hamas to disappear. Obviously, this is more of a wish than a real political analysis, because you need an alternative to it. And the alternative to it, as Abdel Monem said, would be the PA. But the PA has zero legitimacy. And if Abbas tries to go to Gaza, he will be destroyed in Gaza. No Gazan will accept him. And he, at this point,
can bring Barghouti or somebody else. That's mechanics.
Abdel Monem wants to bring Barghouti, but that means elections. And if you want to have elections, then why don't you have a more ambitious plan? In order to be able to have elections, at this time, you need to begin to untangle the Israeli-Palestinian issue. What would be the best way to go, therefore, would be for us to take the regional dimension, the Arab-Israeli dimension, the Saudi normalization process that has been underway, link it in a very serious and significant way to the resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, whereby we create a Palestinian Authority that is empowered, that there is a revived peace process, a two-state solution in place, where let's say the PA, Abdel Monem is right. Abbas does not represent all Palestinians. Today, more 80% of the Palestinians, only 15% of the Palestinians say he should stay president. But he does represent the PA today, I'm afraid. And any attempt to strengthen the Palestinian Authority must involve the revival of the two-state solution and the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, if that can be combined as part of the Saudi, now I say if that can be combined, I'm not saying this will happen, but I'm saying the prospect for moving from the short term to the long term in a manner that would deviate from the Abdel Monem's prediction about the future eruption of violence and terrorism would be for us to narrow the gap between the two dimensions, bringing in the Saudis and the normalization while strengthening the Palestinian Authority and reviving the two-state solution. My concern is there is no Israeli partner for that. The current Israeli government is definitely not a partner for any attempt to revive the two-state solution or to strengthen Abbas. This is why what I said earlier about the short term, I'm afraid if we don't do that, if we don't bring in the two dimensions of the conflict together and try to resolve it, my short-term expectations about Hamas coming back to control Gaza despite everything, and despite Abdel Monem's wish, that will be the long term as well.
This is why, by the way, this is why it's so important to distinguish between the really short term and the longer term. Because in the short term, I completely agree with you. But in the longer term, first of all, I just mentioned a number of elements of how the Israeli domestic scene will change. I think that in addition to what I said, which is the revival of the center, and any Israeli move in that direction requires the rejuvenation of the Israeli center, and center-left. In addition to that, I think that, I mean, again, even to a greater extent than there was reckoning after this 1973 surprise, when it took a few months, but Golda Meir and Dayan had to go, and eventually there were two waves of change, which were the longer-term ramifications. The reckoning in Israel, despite the fact that the bullets are still flying all over the way, and the rockets and missiles are still being launched and so on, the reckoning in Israel has already begun. And I think that and part of that reckoning is not going to be only how foolish could we be to let ourselves be distracted for 10 months from what Israel should have really been focused on, but I think there would be a reckoning also about the general direction of Israeli policy and the general direction of what Israel was focused on and what was its underlying assumptions, just as this was the case after 73 with regard to what were the Israelis thinking when they decided to build a city in a place now called Sharm el-Sheikh, but it already had a Hebrew name. It was going to be called Ophira. Israelis somehow came to this amazing assumption that Egypt would let Israel control the Sinai indefinitely. And the reckoning also addressed that. It wasn't just the issue of Golda and Dayan and so on and so forth. It was a reckoning about all the sets of assumptions that led Israeli policy between 67 and 73. I think that would have to do in Israel with respect to relooking at the two-state solution, relooking at the foolishness of contributing indirectly to Hamas strengthening and to the weakening of the PA and of Abbas and so on. All of this will be part of the Israeli domestic agenda in the next months.
I need to cut now because we do have time for few brief questions, which I'm sure people have. I will ask whoever wants to ask a question to come to the microphone and just introduce themselves. First, if there are any students who would like to address a question, please do, and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, Stephen Bertrand. I'm a junior. I took Professor Feldman's class last semester on the the national security strategy of Israel, and we covered the Dahya doctrine, and we learned about the Second Lebanon War. And my question pertains to the impending ground invasion in Gaza. That, given last panel, you talked about how the south of Israel has felt neglected, and that the Prime Minister has said that the real war is yet to start. Do you think that we'll see another Dahya in Gaza, or whether or not, as Professor Shikaki said, that if there's a chance of maybe integrating Saudi peace with Palestinian peace, that maybe they'll refrain to make that go smoother?
So I would say this, to some extent, we are already in the Dakhia chapter. And to those who were not familiar with 2006 war, the Dakhia is a neighborhood of Beirut, predominantly Shia neighborhood of Beirut, where the Hezbollah headquarters were located, and in whatever the explanation is, trying to go after Hezbollah involved in the case of the second Lebanon war, a flattening, large-scale flattening of this neighborhood called Dakhia. And actually, you would have to also admit that in Israel, there was some thinking in the Israeli Defense Forces, especially by former Chief of Staff Eisenkot, who is now a member of the inner war cabinet. He was the author of something called the Dakhia Doctrine that said this should be the basis of the building block of the Israeli deterrence posture. You guys have to know that if you dare attack us and so on and so forth, the result will be something similar to Dakhia. Now, of course, Gaza is a completely different story than Lebanon, completely different calculations, and so on and so forth. So the applicability of the Dakhia Doctrine is something that can be discussed. But the issue of whether in reality what's going on the ground is not what we saw in Dakhia, no, that's unfortunately, that's already the case. However, and this is again my however, this is it is again my fundamental assumption is that most disasters happen when you haven't even thought about it. This is a case right now, we're in the midst of a case where the worry about this precise possibility is, as I said earlier, is widely held. And this is particularly the case clearly with US policymakers. They are terrified about the consequences of a possible further escalation, widening, broadening, deepening, what we already saw in the first 10 days. Now, whether they'll succeed or not is a different question. But at least they are not operating in some kind of an alternative universe. They are operating in the real universe, taking into account the real threats to the kind of escalation that Abdel Monem was talking about. And now they'll be tested. Now, of course, they can't do it alone. They need partners. They need Egypt. They need Jordan. They need this. And they, again, we saw this backlash in the last day or so from what happened on the ground, which was also part of, never mind. I mean, these kinds of deep exchange of fires involve a lot of such mishaps as happened here. But again, I think the attention right now is on this. Now, whether it's easy now to think about Israeli partners that would help here, Palestinian partners that would help here, we have to admit again we can't live in a different universe. The universe that we live in is that one thing that characterizes, in my view, the main protagonist of this conflict is leadership deficit. Okay, we just don't. Sadat could not have sprung out this enormous success if he didn't have on the Israeli side a leader who actually was like fitting between a glove and a hand. Okay, he was the optimal leader, and I never voted for him. He was a right-wing leader. But he understood. He was exactly the kind of leader that could respond and take what Sadat did with his revolutionary step and do something with it. Whether we have such leadership, I mean, I know what Khalil's answer is on the Palestinian side. I'm afraid that my answer is not very different on the Israeli side. And we'll have to see. I mean, look, let me just one sentence. Look at the graphics of this. The President of the United States sat in a meeting of the Israeli War Cabinet. The President of the United States sat in the meeting of the Israeli War Cabinet. What does that mean? I mean, it means the grown-up came. okay? It means the grown-up basically said, send the message, look, I can't leave this to you guys, okay? You guys, I mean, he basically said what Israelis feel, that basically, 10 days ago, it was clear that Israel does not have the leadership it needs. And whether, again, Biden can substitute, I don't know, but he felt the vacuum, and he said, I'm willing to take the risk. And it is a political risk to do what he said. It identifies the United States so completely deeply with Israel. And you can only control that damage if you reach some kind of understanding with Israel about what the rules of the game are. And it's clear that that's what he's trying to do. But it's a very risky proposition. Why? And this is the last sentence. Because Israel is boiling, because the anger at the massacre, and the pictures and the graphics and so on and so forth, and the fact that we all have friends and family there that suffered. I lost a very, very good friend in the first 4 hours of the conflict. So it's very difficult under those conditions to have the kind of reasoned mind that is required here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Laurel Kane. I'm a sophomore. Thank you so much for coming and speaking. It was mentioned that one of the reasons that Hamas may have attacked at this particular time is because Israel is at a moment of weakness, in particular due to these massive protests that have been happening because of the judicial reforms that have been unpopular with many parts of Israeli society. But it was also mentioned that Iran, is definitely interested in potentially coming into this conflict. And I was reminded of the massive women life freedom protests that happened last year in Iran. So I was wondering how you thought that would perhaps factor into Iran's decision-making in its involvement with this current conflict.
Do you want to try
The
Iranian domestic
regional
politics and society?
Well, I will take it. It's not wish, as Khalil described what I say. I think that's the responsibilities of leaders. If leaders fail, then we will meet a very terrible situation. As we lived through 50 years or 70 years of conflict, a lot of terrible situations. But I just have hope for what is the equation that Khalil put. The equation that Khalil brought, that he referred to it, and he called it wish. For him it was operational. He want, to get the Arab initiative and the Saudi Arabia initiative and where we were 10 days or 2 weeks ago, and to the present moment. I think I'm of the opinion that Hamas does not fit into this. And the idea is how to give it exit that's possible through the empowerment of the Palestinian original and the only legal and the only legitimate organ of representing the Palestinian, which is the PLO. I, as an optimist, I will say, is it possible? I will say yes. But yes, when? Shai referred to the older man came. It has two sides, by the way. Biden sitting on the war game of Israel. That means a total USA support to the Israelis. Nobody will know what he's telling them is to know the limits of power. If I learned from President Sadat anything, is that he knows the limits of power and the power of signals to get it to others. When he came to the 1973 war, he came to the 1973 after he offered to open the Suez Canal, after he opened channels with the United States, and through the United States to Israel. So there was a lot of things realizing about, that there is a new game we can build together. You need sometimes to use force to awaken people up, which happened in 1973. Yet, that's not yet here. But I am waiting. What Egypt is trying now, not under Sadat, it's under Sisi. Sisi want to hold the conference in Cairo or in Sharm el-Sheikh why Sharm el-Sheikh, it is a city of peace, actually, it's considered like that, is to make that conference in it, or in the new capital, something related to building something. So these are signals. Is it enough or not? Unfortunately, history does not tell us, when things work and when it doesn't work. It needs generation of historians to decide and fight over what. But the only thing I am bidding or wishing that people get a little bit tired. I mean, the situation is very ugly. And as I said, it's bringing the Nakba and the Holocaust together, which is something very powerful emotionally. So I hope here leaders will calculate this. Without doing that, we are getting into what happened, because we have sometimes moments of success, Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, Jordanian ones, the Oslo agreements, the Madrid conference. These are moments of success. You bring a lot of contradictory things together and then use it to move and make a path to progress. We're still human beings. We are short in wisdom to say that's inevitable. We got to work on it. I see signs of Egypt to do it. And particularly the meeting that was supposed to happen in Amman, I was bidding on it a lot. To cook that kind of a situation, how to make the linkage between the near past and the future. Can we now pass it after the event? I don't know. Why? Probably Al-Jihad al-Islami did the missile, or an Israeli pilot missed the target, whatever. But it happens, these things. But I am just, and that's of the study and believing, I know Americans, when they hear the word reform in the Middle East, they said that's something they don't think that is there. But the Middle East is going, and at least the majority of countries, going through a fundamental historical process of reform. If it happened in the United States, it happened in the 1960s. Only after 3 centuries of the American Revolution, so a couple of centuries of the American Revolution. After the Civil War was 1 century. The Middle East is moving ahead now. It is not like Switzerland or the United States or other countries. But it is happening there in terms of modernization. Something to care about, that violence is going to destroy what you are building. I don't know if I answered the question or not.
Another student?
Hello, my name is Ava Shaw. I am a sophomore. Last semester, I took Alexander Kay's class in the Arab-Israeli conflict. I'm deeply grateful for your book. It gave me and my classmates information and nuance that we would not have had otherwise. With sort of probably a gross simplification of the history, and I might be forgetting or misremembering some details. It seems that the Oslo process sort of transformed the PLO and Fatah from more terrorist organizations into the legitimate government of the West Bank and a potential peace partner for Israel. And you, during this panel, it was also mentioned, Sinwar trying to have sort of a Sadat moment in earlier, hoping more of a smaller conflict to create some better peace potential. I remember also hearing, even though Hamas is unpopular in a lot of ways, it doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. So what I'm curious about is if in spite of the recent atrocities, if there is any conditions that could be met anytime soon-ish or in the near future that could cause Hamas to be in some way maybe negotiated with or reorganized or something to make it more legitimate of a Gazan government or peace partner in any sort of way. There's no way to get rid of it.
Khalil, do you want to address that?
It will be very difficult for Israel to believe that Hamas can be a partner in the future. As far as the Palestinians are concerned, there is no doubt that Hamas remains, despite everything that Hamas has done, a legitimate political player, domestic political player. Hamas does have a value system that is not shared by the majority of the Palestinians. But it is a political party. It might change its name. The name Hamas might no longer be used. But those views that Hamas represents today are an integral part of the Palestinian value system and the Palestinian thinking about the conflict. There is an Israeli-Palestinian peace that is moving forward. This mindset that Hamas is capitalizing on and has been capitalizing on would disappear. Abdel Monem would be right that Hamas will go because people will see there is no role for Hamas, because Hamas, in fact, was created in order to address this heightened tension between Palestinians and Israelis. When the peace process was moving forward, the Oslo agreement that you looked at moved forward, the support for Hamas in Palestinian society went down considerably. Support for Hamas rose only when the Israeli-Palestinian peace process was essentially moving away from the original goals. If we can put them back on track, Hamas would no longer be needed for the thing that you wanted it to be. That is an interlocutor in terms of governing Gaza and so on. The problem is, I do not anticipate that there will be progress in the peace process. If Shai is right, and there is a change in Israel that could bring about the center and the Palestinian Authority, whether it is Abbas or somebody else, might be able to come to a certain accommodation in which this Palestinian Authority can control Gaza. But in that case, Hamas will be, there should be no confusion about this. Hamas will be an integral part of that Palestinian Authority. It will be sitting in the parliament because there isn't going to be any strong and revived Palestinian Authority without going to elections. And whether Hamas will participate as Hamas or as under any other name, there will be people who share Hamas's values and political attitudes who will be sitting in that Palestinian parliament. And that is the way it should be. You are not going to be able to eliminate 1/3 of the Palestinian society who share Hamas's values. That is where we are today. Hamas might be popular at certain times, less popular at other times. Hamas is least popular when there is progress in the peace process. Hamas is most popular when Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy and peace is dead. And that is where we are now. And this is why Hamas, in my view, in the short term, will be the one to come back to control Gaza.
And which again goes back to this point, which is the difference between the immediate or very short term and the long term. And in the short term, it's very, very difficult. In the short term, I completely agree with Khalil. In the long term, it's a different story. The present circumstances are not such that Israelis have an open ear and an open eye to changes. The degree of distrust of Hamas after the horrific acts and pictures of 10 days ago does not leave the Israelis in a listening mode. And that's, I think, perfectly understandable, which is the reason why if we did have any evidence that Hamas was willing, as I said, to travel the path that Fatah and the PLO did without this immediate eruption and horrific development, that I think would have been a different story. In the short term, first of all, as I said, in Israel, the blood is still boiling, and also there is also another aspect of all of this, which is that in the short term, another dimensions of all this is in the short term, the Iran-led camp, whether it planned this, what was its precise role in answering why it happened on October 7, 2023, is beside the point. The Hamas is part of and is seen regionally as part of the Iran camp. And in the short tactical operational level, Hamas had an amazing, unexpected, enormous success in the first 3 or 4 days. That means that the bad guys have won some important points. And it's going to take, and again, I mean, so again, go back to 50 years ago. The perception in Israel that I think led to all the political transformations that followed was not the result of the 2.5 or 3 week war. Israel actually, operationally, you could say operationally, you may have said Israel won the war. Israel ended the war with its forces on the other side of the Suez Canal, and the Third Army surrendered and so on and so forth. The perception was sieged. The perception, sieged, yeah. They played some soccer in between.
I was in the Second Army.
Right. So, but again, the perception, the immediate perception that without which you couldn't understand why Israelis so quickly parted with these very strong basis of policy that they adhered to since 1967 was because the impression of the amazing success of the Egyptians in the first day of the war, and one has to say, operationally, the Israelis suffered a huge hit in the first 3 or 4 days of the war. Now, you know, the Arab world is celebrating the first pictures. It's also mourning the immediate aftermath, but everybody still, in Hebrew, somehow they adopted this term, we're in the middle of the event. We're in the middle of the event. It means we don't have enough perspective to see where all this is going.
We approached the end, or past the end, but Professor Bellin, you wanted to make a comment?
The majority center and corral them. So I guess what I'd like to hear from both Shai and Khalil. Khalil, where is someone like Salam Fayyad? Is he a possibility as someone who could lead the center if Abbas were gone?
He's at Harvard today.
Okay, and Shai, the question for you, I'm thinking of those amazing stories of those generals.
Today.
He's speaking at Harvard.
Of those generals who drove their cars from Tel Aviv, you know, down to save their sons and are the epitome of the strong soldier who takes initiative. He could capture the imagination of the center right, way away from Netanyahu. Is there somebody there that could play that leadership role?
Do you want me to? I'll start. I'll start. It wasn't immediately apparent that Rabin would be the person. Okay, Rabin was ambassador in the US. He was brought back to Israel. He was brought into the government as Minister of Labor. You know, it took time for Rabin to emerge. And yes, there are some personalities like Gantz. He enjoys unprecedented. Now, of course, it's by default because all the rest have done so much worse than him. But the answer is yes, it's possible. And here I'll just say one more word. Here's the paradox here. It's not just the center has woken up. We face an even bigger, and if you wish, real paradox and a real silver lining. The protest movement, and especially the core of this protest movement, called Brothers and Sisters in Arms, they turned out from being the spearheading of the protests over 40 to 50 weeks to actually the real effective only first responders in the Israeli South. Because all of them are retired military, they know how to organize. They're the first ones who came, and they now play a leading role in the first efforts at reconstruction. They are the core of the Israeli center, and now they also figured out, just like I expect the grown-ups, the Egyptians and so on, to tell the children, okay, you got to play this differently. We now have a completely, a big strata of the Israeli public, the best and the brightest, that said, for the first time in 25 years, politics is too important to leave to politicians. And now, like some Americans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and now serving in the US Congress, who see public life as a continuation of their public service, I grant you, in 6 months or 8 months and 10 months, you'll see the leaders of the protest movement running in elections and getting involved and getting elected to the Knesset.
Yeah, just I guess the environment will improve by the working of moderate Arab countries into this process. I see in the Arab press, in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, there is now a distinction between the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian people, and the Hamas. I mean, there is no one intellectual who's not saying that Hamas, that the Palestinian has the right to make resistance, but they have no right to make terrorist operations. And the definition of terrorist operations is to do the operations against the civilian people. I mean, that is well defined. It's said on television and the newspapers. And the Palestinian cause that we have, something since 1948, is not remedied. It's not treated. It is not healed until now. And we have the Palestinian people who is in the West Bank and in Gaza and in the diaspora. And I will say also inside Israel, that got a role and they got a position, and also they are not under any system of justice, and they're living as citizens within Israel. So we have a package for the Palestinian people. I guess that's give a big kind of space for Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Morocco, Jordan to do, and do the signals. I am raising, in front of what Netanyahu say, we make peace for peace. I said, we make peace for those who want peace with us. And I guess there is a good bulk of Israeli people in the middle who have that we will live together. That's the definition of peace. But there are also other people who doesn't believe in that. But if we make the people who like us on the other side, we both will be winners. What's happening now with an alliance between the two others who are on the other side of the fence?
For the overwhelming majority of the Palestinians, the source of legitimacy is electoral. If you win elections, you have legitimacy. However, voters will vote for those who have already demonstrated legitimacy in defending the Palestinian rights. And that excludes Fayyad. That means people like Barghouti are the ones who can win. However, people like Barghouti don't know how to manage the economy, don't know how to build strong public institutions, don't know how to respect the independence and integrity of civil society. Salam Fayyad, people like Salam Fayyad are the ones who can do that. So the future, and I can see very clearly that people like Fayyad and people like Barghouti can work together. But of course, I say this knowing that Barghouti is in jail, in an Israeli jail. He's a terrorist as far as the Israelis are concerned, but a national hero as Palestinians are concerned. But if there is going to be any legitimate, that is elected leadership for the Palestinian people in the near future, it will be people like Barghouti working closely with people like Fayyad.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone here in the library and in Zoom. I, for one, heard a lot of cautionary notes, which were concerning, as well as some silver linings and mechanicals for the long term, which I will cling into. I only hope that this leadership or lack of leadership will maybe listen to our panel a little bit more often. Thank you very much.